the very best entrepreneurs are people who recognise what they're not good at and then surrounding themselves with people who can bring that extra dimension.
I always think about good agency being about trust, pride and camaraderie.
There in the middle of the desk was a 12-page document headed Breakaway Plan. And I picked it up and I looked at it and I'm like, I better not touch that.
I found something like that once at Iris. It was like 10 years in. So welcome to the next edition of Entrepreneurs in the Wild, and joining me for this session is somebody that I've known for a long time and has had a massive effect on my career and lots of other people's career in our industry, John Farrell. Before I ask John to say a few words about himself, it's worth me just sort of explaining a little bit more about what we're trying to achieve with Entrepreneurs in the Wild. And really, the whole series is about trying to understand what it is about entrepreneurs that makes them different. You know, are there certain traits that make them stand out? And also, is there a little bit of the entrepreneur in all of us? So, John, thank you so much for joining us. It's a real privilege and honour to have you here. I must say, before you say a few words about yourself, Iris has got a very strong connection to IMP. And when I joined IMP as a graduate trainee, you were the CEO. But it'd be great for you just to say a few words about yourself and, you know, where you're at now and your journey.
Well, firstly, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm honoured that you've included me in this, and I'll try and give you a few insights into what I think makes a successful entrepreneur along the way. My background is from now probably the mid-80s. I was running IMP, and that at the time was the leading sales promotion and direct marketing agency in the UK. IMP was owned by Darcy Macias Benton and Bowles, and I got approached by the American owners to take over the Darcy Group in London, which at the time was quite a revolutionary development, because putting a below-the-line person in charge of one of the top 3 advertising agencies at the time in the UK was a pretty bold step by the Americans. But the reason they did it was because it was at the beginning of integrated marketing thinking. And although IMP was the number 1 agency in its field and Darcy was one of the top 3 in its field, to say that they didn't get on would be an understatement. So there was very little collaboration, and there was a huge missed opportunity that the Americans wanted to have, and they thought the only way to get it was to put one person in charge. So that was me. Apropos of nothing, Campaign magazine at the time, front page story was "Shelf Wobbler takes over Darcy." But anyway, I took over running the agency group, and then ended up going to the States, running North America, and ultimately running Darcy globally, which was one of the top 10 networks in the world. Privately held, sold 40% to Leo Burnett. Together with Leo, we created BCom3 and then sold the entire company to Publicis. I then went and worked with Maurice Levy. Maurice wanted me to go and live and work in Paris. I like Paris, but I don't want to live there or work there. So I left and started my own business, which is what I do today, which basically does 2 things. It helps digital marketing services, media, advertising agency businesses with their growth agenda, and then I help sell them using my M&A skills. And in the last 8 years, I've led the successful exit of 21 different agencies for a transaction value of just over 1.5 billion euro. So it was a hobby which has turned into quite a lucrative one.
That's fantastic. And that's an incredible ride, isn't it? If I could just sort of start there by just talking a little bit more about IMP. I was at IMP for a few years, I don't know, 4 years, something like that. And I can remember it so clearly. I mean, we were in Knightsbridge at the time. It was a real atmosphere. You know, it was full of extremely talented, ambitious, pace-setter people. And obviously, IMP at some point gave birth to all sorts of businesses in our industry. Obviously, there was a contingent that went to Hal Henry, as you'll remember.
Yeah.
Chris Satterthwaite, Ian Priest, Adrian Coleman.
Yeah.
Obviously, that then led to a small agency called VCCP being created. A whole load of us, younger people, we left, as the publicist thing was emerging, and we set up, a small agency called Iris that also went on to become a good global company, and there were others too. Geronimo, there were Dialogue. There were loads. Probably too many to mention. So I'm just curious. You were the driving force of IMP, and did you know that it was so entrepreneurial? When you were leading it.
Yeah, I think I did know. I couldn't have predicted all of the successes that you've just outlined, and you're right. There were many, many of them. I don't think any other sort of agency group in the late 80s and early 90s produced quite as many CEOs or leaders of great businesses as IMP. And I think there was something, it was definitely the culture of the organisation. There was a real sense that this business was a bit different, and that there was almost like a we don't mind who doesn't like us because we're going to do it our way, and it was powerful. One of the things that I think made the people at that time successful was there was a willingness to take things on, to do to do the unexpected, but they did it within the context of we're all in this together. And I think that one of the first lessons I learnt in that entrepreneurial culture was that yes, I was ambitious, I wanted to do well for myself, but the smart people realised that the way you made progress was by working with others who complemented your skill set and could bring another dimension. And I don't think that's changed for entrepreneurs over the years. The very best entrepreneurs are people who recognise what they're not good at, as well as capitalising on what they are good at, and then surrounding themselves with people who can bring that extra dimension. But going back to that IMP of the late 80s and early 90s, it was an unbelievably exciting agency to be part of. I think you'd agree, because every day was remarkable. We really did live hard, work hard, play hard. Culture was part of it, but in a healthy way. It wasn't offensive. It wasn't. It might have been offensive to the competition, but it wasn't offensive to the people within the organisation. It was collaborative. And at the same time, people knew when they dealt with IMP, clients knew and prospects knew when they dealt with IMP, not only were they going to get a great job done, they were going to have a lot of fun doing it. Yeah. The number of times I can remember clients having, great times with the agency as part of the business of doing business with the agency. But it was all about, a shared vision of what we were trying to create.
That's very true, and it was intoxicating. I always think about good agencies being about trust, pride and camaraderie. Yeah, of course, agencies sort of stand for different things and do different things. But fundamentally, the really good agencies are about those three key things. And when I walked into IMP as a sort of, 21, 22-year-old or whatever it was, knowing nothing, no experience, and you could see all these amazing, like John Quarry and Alan Thompson and people like that, and just amazing people.
Yeah.
And not only were they talented pace setters, really, top of their game, it wasn't hierarchical, which is a sort of odd dimension to it, really. So what that meant was you had permission, so you could take on responsibility, you could try things, you could experiment, and you could fail on a few things without any sort of sense of fear. And I think that is probably a big part of certainly my experience, as I was obviously very young at the time. That was a massive part of why I loved it so much.
It was anything is possible time. And that was the whole ethos and culture of the organisation. We'll find a way. When you talk about trust, there was an inherent trust amongst everyone that, we had each other's backs, and good agencies are like that. There was also a sort of cultural piece to it where there was a pride in individual performance as well. There was a sense that, how can we help you achieve your objectives? How can we help you build the business? When I joined, there was a guy called Mike Johnson was together with Brian Francis and Jeff Marshall, the three of them started the agency. And if you achieved a certain number, then Mike would take you out for lunch. And it was, it was just all part of the culture of, an underlying, you've got to get it done. Pretty target driven looking back on it. I mean, there was it didn't feel like you were being pushed to achieve, but everyone wanted to. Yeah. Everyone wanted to succeed. And failure just didn't seem like an option.
Yeah, well, I remember that so clearly. I remember working harder than I've ever worked before at IMP, but also really enjoying it. I just didn't mind. And it was because I felt like we were all on a bit of a mission, and it was competitive. It was about taking on the industry and pushing the boundaries and doing what other people thought you couldn't.
Yeah, and we loved winning, and luckily we did a lot of it. And I think all of the people, the Satterthwaites, the Colemans, and too many to remember. They got used to winning, and when they went off, with yourself, with Iris as well, you get used to winning, and then you recreate that, or you try and recreate that environment where you go next. I cannot believe the number of people who've succeeded coming out of that culture.
It sounds like a bit alpha and a bit kind of one-dimensional, but in fact, there were loads of dimensions to it, in my experience, because there were plenty of kind of go-getter pace setters that were quite extrovert, but there was also loads of people that were more nurturing, more caring, more enabling. So I was very close to Peter Hollins, and he had a massive role in helping me and some of the people that then moved on to Iris later. And also, as you remember, Mike Spicer was also a big, very close to me and very important, to me and my journey. And they were very much about enabling, you as you and your career. And you don't see that these days.
You say you don't see that these days. I would hope in the best companies you do. And because what you're talking about is what I referred to earlier as this sort of collaborative nature.
Yeah.
On the one hand, IMP was a really strange mixture of highly competitive with highly competitive people, but at the same time, internally, it was amazingly collaborative. People went out of their way to try and help others succeed in the company. And, if that meant trampling all over the opposition, so be it. And there was we took a lot of pride in winning, as I said before. But you're right. I mean, and maybe this is part of about what constitute successful entrepreneurs. I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all. People like myself who are quite outward-facing, quite gregarious, quite overtly confident, need people like the Peter Hollins, the Mike Spicers of this world around them to be successful. Because otherwise, the thing would implode. Even if I think about the most senior people in the agency, there was a balance.
So, like, moving on, when you're looking at companies and when you're working with entrepreneurs who founded a business, scaled a business, and you're talking to them about their journey, are you taking some of that with you? Because again, going back to what you said before, you at the heart of all these big successes is that team, that collaboration, whilst also being competitive.
I mean, I think a lot of what I do now is to look at companies, to take a point of view on their level of entrepreneur ability. And I think, one of the first criteria for judgment for me is the vibe they send about themselves as people.
Yeah.
I'm in the very fortunate position now that I only ever work with people that I want to spend time with. Most agency chiefs don't have that choice when they're working with clients. But if I get a good vibe from them as people, that, they're people that I want to spend time with, then that's a pretty good start point. Then beyond that, I like to understand more about the people they've surrounded themselves with. What does their leadership team look like? How empowered is the leadership team? Who does what, and how do they connect with each other to create success? And then once you've got past all those people elements and the collaborative element, of course you look at the financials and you look at the numbers and you get a sense of what I would call the bullshit meter. Is there is this real, or do they talk a good game, but, the numbers don't lie? And then you put that together, and then that gives you the package of understanding of whether they're people that I want to work with, and in my judgment, whether I think they're entrepreneurs who are going to succeed.
I can really relate to that. I just think back on the businesses that we've acquired as Iris over the years. And in the end, it's really been about the people. Do we believe in them? Do they believe in us?
Yeah.
If there's something bad happens, what we're going to do? Yeah. More so than what their skill is or what their business plan is saying. Your business plan is a sort of moment in time, isn't it? When it's like buying a car. The car will look its best, and the reality is when you've done a few school runs, it doesn't look so good.
You can't be sure, because you'll have experienced this in Iris when you're acquiring companies. You only get, of course you do due diligence, and of course you take advice, and of course you go up one side and down the other side of trying to understand the company. But you can only go so far with that. At some point you have to make that leap of trust that it's going to work, and that 1 + 1 is going to equal 3 in terms of what you and they together can create. I think experience counts for a lot.
Yeah.
I think I'm pretty good at sniffing out whether this is real or whether it's make-believe.
Just on IMP, it's like I bumped into you in the lift. I think you were on the way to a meeting. I think Jane Pendleby was with you, and you had a mobile phone. And I think that really, you stood out because you were the only person I knew that had a mobile phone at that point in history.
You're betraying how old we are here. You know that, don't you? Only person with a mobile phone. Oh God.
And I just wondered, what took you to being the CEO of IMP? What was your journey before IMP? How did you get to that point?
Well, it wasn't straightforward. When I left university, I decided that I wanted to go into the advertising and marketing world because a great friend of mine, a guy called David Moore, was working for an agency which no longer exists called Clark Bubear Hill. And as far as I could see, he was having the best time meeting lots of fun people and getting paid for it. And I thought, I'll have some of that. Yeah. That sounds like the sort of industry I want to be part of. So I got on, I lived at home in Rickmansworth in Hertfordshire in those days. I got on the Metropolitan line, went to Baker Street with a list of the top 15 agencies in London at the time that I'd got through desk research. And I walked into the reception of all 15 during the day and asked for an interview with the managing director. With a CV in my hand, a very poor CV, I might add, Ian, a CV in my hand, and very little else. Yeah. And unbeknownst to me, one of the three was IMP, and because they thought I had so much front, they couldn't believe it, just wandering into reception asking for an interview for a job. Brian Francis saw me and he hired me.
That was incredible.
Now, I would not recommend that to anyone listening or watching this podcast, because I'm sure nowadays
security will sort that out.
You wouldn't get through to Ian Millner's office by just wandering into Iris reception nowadays. But maybe you should. Brian Francis, who was my mentor, the person I looked to as my entrepreneurial inspiration in many ways, he went off and started an agency called Francis Killingbeck Bain.
Yes.
And I learnt one of my first lessons in being a budding entrepreneur, which is, if you're going to be one of the 5 founding directors, the 3 with their name on the top of the letter heading are probably going to get a better deal than the 2 on the bottom of the letter heading. So I didn't stay there very long, and then I got hired back to IMP when I was 26 and a half years old as managing director of what at the time was probably an agency of 170, 180 people.
Yeah.
And most of them were older than me. So that was quite an interesting early stage challenge for my career. That's how I got going. And then fortunately for me, it went really well and the business went from strength to strength.
So what was that like then, when you sort of transitioning from a setting that you've been able to shape? So what was that like, and what sort of welcome did you get?
Well, the welcome was not entirely open-armed. Firstly, the campaign headline didn't help, when I arrived. Secondly, at the time, the agency was run by 2 guys, and the Americans, in their infinite wisdom, the week before they appointed me, fired one of them and put me into his office. So, to say that I was not super popular when I arrived would be an understatement. The thing that the clients of Darcy cared about was I going to make a difference to their business? They didn't really care about our internal politics or dynamics. Was I going to bring value add to their business? And one thing was absolutely for sure was that, you had all of this talent at IMP that was world class at what it did, and you had all this talent at Darcy that was world class at what it did, and a missing link in the middle. So, I was really pushing on an open door in terms of the opportunity that I was being given by the Americans to create, to add that value. And the first thing I did was to try and set about taking the top clients at each of those 2 entities and bringing added value to those top clients. And again, the growth over the following 2 or 3 years when we started doing that was astonishing, because you had really good raw material in both agencies. One of the challenges I had was that Graham, who didn't stay very long after I arrived, his office was literally about 5 meters from my office. And I was in every morning at 7 a.m. I was leaving every night at 9 p.m., doing all the things you do. The phone goes, and picked up the phone. There's this sort of giggling on the other end, and I thought, well, that's not a client. As I put the phone down, I looked down on the desk, and there in the middle of the desk, Graham had very distinctive handwriting. There in the middle of the desk was a 12-page document in his handwriting headed Breakaway Plan. And it was the plan that he'd handwritten between him and Tony, and what we can tell Farrell, what we can't tell Farrell, clients we think we can get on day 1, clients we think we can get after 6 months, people in the agency who we would want to try and hire after. And it was literally chapter and verse of the Breakaway Plan. And I picked it up and I looked at it and I'm like, I better not touch that. And I thought,
well, just in case you get your fingerprints checked, he was like, I don't want to be part of this.
I don't want to be part of it. So anyway, needless to say, I did pick it up, I did photocopy it, and I did put it back on the desk, and we had a change in leadership later that day.
That is amazing, isn't it? Like, luck sometimes kind of works in a way, you know what I mean?
Absolutely.
And I found something like that once at Iris. It was like 10 years in, somebody found a business plan that somebody had rather cleverly chose to print out on an Iris printer. And this person then found it, put it in a little folder for me and left it on my desk with a smiley face. And it's like, wow, that's pretty helpful. That's pretty good, actually, some of this stuff. But it's
I
amazing.
might do that myself.
But I think, obviously life has a way of balancing things out, doesn't it, sometimes? And, finding out problems. Listening to that story, it's a bit like they wanted it to be found. It's a bit like a cry for help. You know what I mean? Who knows?
I don't know. I don't know about that. But I mean, moving on from when I left the London group, which was, by far the biggest communications group in the UK when I left.
Yeah.
I then went to America, and that was another whole sort of leadership experience because, if I wasn't terribly popular going into Darcy in London, going into Darcy in New York was a step down from that, really. Because not only was I a shelf wobbler by background, I was also British. And back in that time, the stories around, or the number of Brits that had gone to the States and failed was like unbelievable. There were very, very, very few who actually made the cut. When I got to New York, the first meeting I had was with the then boss, a guy called Roy Bostock. And Bostock said to me, "Oh, by the way, John, I need you to go to Detroit tomorrow." Really? Why is that? He said, "Well, a couple of issues with General Motors and, why don't you pop over?" So anyway, I went to Detroit the following day, and the couple of issues with General Motors were that our 102-year relationship with Cadillac was under review. And I sat through a budget review, and the Cadillac budget at that time was 2/3 of the total revenues of the entire London Darcy group. Just Cadillac. And I thought, better sort this one out. Better sort this one out.
You have my attention.
Yeah.
You've obviously moved around a lot. You've had an amazing career. It'd be good just to understand a bit more about the sort of differences in culture that you've experienced.
I mean, maybe to start that, the difference between Publicis as a French holding company and Darcy as an American-based global organisation out of New York.
Yeah.
One of the things which really struck me, the Americans would have meetings and make a decision. It was a good meeting if you made a decision, and it was a rubbish meeting if you didn't make a decision. So you would make a decision. But the following week, you might have a meeting and make exactly the reverse decision, because that was the principle that, you have meetings to make decisions. The French culture was completely different. And the French culture, meetings were not about making decisions. Meetings were where you endorsed things that had been decided over a coffee somewhere the day before or the week before or whatever, or over a good meal or a dinner or something. And there was a formality to the American approach that was completely different to the French approach. And yet, neither's right and neither's wrong. They're just different. So I think that understanding the culture of the organisation, understanding the drivers about what makes decisions, and perhaps more importantly than what makes them effective, you would not apply the same criteria to being in Iris that you would to being in Publicis. It would be like putting a square peg in a round hole. It just wouldn't work. So getting to really understand what that culture is and how you drive decision making, I think is crucially important. And, I learned quite a few lessons when I first was at Publicis. which really taught me, as I said before, that it wasn't that one was right and one was wrong. It's just that you've got to understand which is which if you're going to succeed.
Yeah, it's such a good point, that. And what I've found over the last few years, particularly when I come into contact with smaller businesses that are scaling, one of the most important things about that company is how it makes a decision, and more importantly, how it then makes sure that decision is followed through upon.
Yeah,
and it's like there's a sort of, I mean, obviously the whole kind of idea of the entrepreneur sort of implies, creativity and imagination and, charisma and all those sort of, positive but somewhat, chaotic traits. But I think that discipline, follow through, clarity around decision making and how that then shows up in the company, that's such an important thing. And I think that is one of the things I've noticed is the difference between a good company with potential that gets somewhere and one that is just a good company that sort of drifts and doesn't.
Yeah, it's the oldest story in agency business, but agencies very rarely lack people who have good ideas. There are lots of people in agencies who have good ideas. What they lack is people who are good at taking those ideas and turning them into practical execution that adds value to clients' business and creates success. It sounds almost simplistic when you put it like that, but I've seen it so many times. And it doesn't need to be complex or complicated. I work with 25, 30 different agencies in the last 8-9 years, and they have many, many, many differences. But one of the things that unifies the successful ones is the quality of their execution.
Yeah.
So if I take a company like Oliver, who I've worked with for some time, Oliver is actually a bizarrely simple idea. It's in housing. It's a bizarrely simple idea, but they're just genius at executing.
Yeah.
And because they're genius at executing, they've had an unbelievably successful run. It doesn't have to be complicated, but it has to be well done.
And also when you're sort of thinking about M&A and you're looking at businesses that are growing, are there sort of categories within the industry that you're particularly tuned into because there's a lot of potential in them?
I think those categories have changed over the last 10 years or so since I've been doing my own thing. Without sounding too, hopefully, overt about it, I tend to associate myself with businesses that I think are going to sell, because that's a big part of what I do, that I help with the growth agenda, and then I help monetize the asset. The space where I feel like there's real value at the moment, media companies that are beyond cookies is exciting space. Business to business, which is at what I would describe at the technology end, not with technology clients necessarily, but that has tech of their own.
Yeah.
Digital agencies which are not reliant purely on creativity is exciting space for me. So there's a whole change in the buyer community which reflects their understanding of where the hot space is as well. So it's. I think there are exciting times ahead for what used to be defined as marketing services and now I think is much broader.
One of the things that sort of has occurred to me over the last few years is about post-deal and the degree to which value that has been hard won and built over a long period of time can be lost because there isn't enough thought into, but now what? And how do we keep people and how do we make sense of this business that we've just acquired in the context of everything else?
Yeah, I have really strong views about that. I think that too many acquirers look at the today rather than the future.
Yeah.
And it's a big mistake because, if you just look at the today, the first thing is, what happens to all the top talent in, when the earn-out's over. And then the second thing is, if you focus on today, you're not going to end up with innovation or excitement around the 1 + 1 = 3 equation that you ought to be creating. So I completely agree that acquirers have a real responsibility to think that through and to co-create the future with the businesses that they're acquiring. That also gives them the best chance of avoiding having that top talent disappear out the door as well, because it will be a more exciting environment to be part of. Funnily enough, I think one of the challenges could be, how does the acquirer recreate that entrepreneurial culture that was the reason they bought that business in the first place? How do they, manage a situation where you have that 1 + 1 = 3? You have that environmental excitement. How do you co-create that when you bring in new people and you don't make them feel like they're an add-on, but they're integral to the success of the company?
Yeah, it can be like oil and water. You have a load of actual entrepreneurs who've built a business from scratch, perhaps. Yeah, probably. They've got vision, passion, charisma. They go through a process that can be very long-winded and can be lacking in transparency and can erode a lot of those incredibly positive things that they're carrying with them in their business. And then if they get through a deal process, then they find themselves at the other end in a corporate setting. That company may not have actually really thought through what it requires to make that team now carry on being successful and also make them worth the money that they've just paid for them.
I mean, the process is a really interesting point that you make as well, because I'm a great believer that good deals have got momentum.
Yes.
If you fall over the line, exhausted at the end of a 9-month due diligence process, well, guess what? All of those entrepreneurial instincts have been drained out of them like the swamp. It's just not going to work. So good deals have got momentum. People, of course, you have to be serious about M&A and you have to have due diligence process and all the rest of it. It's amazing how needs must. And a number of times I've seen situations where, a management team has disappeared, maybe to go off and start their own business, and the owner of the existing company thinks, I've got to get some new people in to run this, and I need them really quickly. And guess what? An M&A can be a solution to that. And guess what? How quickly can they move when they have to move?
Absolutely.
So, I would urge people on the buy side of M&A to recognise that good deals have got momentum, and it's not about being cavalier, but it is about trying to create a feeling, even in the process of the acquisition, that it's going to be a positive experience once the acquisition's been made.
And just one last question, really, and it's really just about you and your journey. And is there any advice that you could give the young John Farrell?
Well, I think if I was going to give myself some advice, I think I would start by saying I would be a better listener. I think that in the sort of high ambition that I had from the beginning of my career, occasionally that resulted in me not taking full advantage of the wisdom around me of others. You could argue that I've done all right, and I think I have done all right. I think I could have done even better if I'd listened more. Yeah. Probably leave it there if I was you, Ian. I would say that better listening would result in an even better John Farrell.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for joining me, and thank you so much for tuning in. And look out for the next edition of Entrepreneurs in the Wild from wherever you get your podcast from. Thank you.